Thank you so much as well to everyone who joins us for Zoom into Books and our friends at Headline Books for inviting us to host the show today. It's going to be a treat because I had to talk to my old buddy Rick Robinson. Rick is a best-selling, multi-award-winning author, and his brand new book is called 1968. And I love the subtitle is A Primer for Understanding Baby Boomers. Rick is a guy who normally does political thrillers, novels. Some of my favorite books have been written by Rick. He's bounced between Washington, D.C. and greater Cincinnati area. He is a recovering attorney when he's not writing books. And welcome into the show. And I have to ask you, Rick, up front, this is a whole different thing for you. This is a nonfiction book. You're basically known as this political thriller novelist guy. So how did that happen?
It's a funny story how it actually happened, Burke, is that I was working on the next novel, working on the next Richard Thompson thriller.
Right.
And I had a fact, and I can't even remember what the fact was, but it's one of those, I didn't want to do it via the internet. I wanted to go down and grab a book, open it up, read. And so I went down to the local public library here in Kentucky, the Kenton County Library, went up and started reading, and it led me down a rabbit hole of newspapers. Now, the interesting thing here is that when people, we hear so much today about politics and what's going on politically, and everybody goes, oh my God, the country's going to hell in a handbasket. And
Right.
My response has always been, well, it ain't 1968. They're not shooting at presidential candidates. We don't have a war going on. We're not, all these various things. And I got to thinking, I was 10 years old in 68. I started looking at newspapers that day from 1968. And before I got, an hour into it, suddenly it dawned on me, there's a book here. Because there were, as opposed to saying it wasn't 1968, the similarities are just striking when you get into it. And so that's how I started. That's how the book came about. I literally put the next novel aside and felt like I was compelled to write this one.
There's an amazing amount of historical events that happened in 1968. And as I talked to some friends who were around in the middle of all that, when you talk about controversies, that was, Vietnam, that was Martin Luther King's assassination, Bobby Kennedy's assassination. I've got friends from Washington, D.C. that remember vividly the huge civil rights marches there and the burning of Chocolate City, protest everywhere. And now here we are in 2024, and you have people taking shots at the president. We actually have a big similarity between Lyndon Johnson stepping away and Joe Biden stepping away. So I think it makes sense as to why you wrote this book on 1968. But of all of those amazing news events, which one do you think was the defining story of 1968? Was it the deaths of King and Kennedy? Was it Vietnam?
Everything in 1968 had to do with Vietnam. It had some tangential effect on what was going on. Everything was about 1968. You have this at the start of the year, what you have Tet. Starts on January 31st, the Tet Offensive.
Right.
And that day was actually the bloodiest day of the Vietnam War. And while not to diminish anything that has happened since, I've noted on other interviews, recently we had 4 soldiers who were killed by drone attacks over in the Middle East. Horrible, horrible situation. This is not to diminish that. But think about this. In 1968, on the first day of Tet, 248 young men were killed.
Wow.
And when you start the year with that, and you start the year with that going on, and there's a peace movement going on, and there's those that want to escalate the war, there's those that want to pull back, you have all this thing happening in a presidential election year. It became the story over and over and over again. And I think 68, again, is one of the most pivotal years in American history. But when you take a look at it in particular, it was a year where America was changing. It was going to concerns about Vietnam. It was going to concerns about what was going to happen in the presidential election based upon that. And those are the things that I think that stick out on my mind, is that even when you get to the music side of it, that you and I love, the music side of it,
Right.
you know, you have people coming out with the protest songs of the 60s is taking it further. Won't you please come to Chicago for the message that we will bring? Those type of things. Everything revolved around Vietnam.
The book is 1968. It's brand new from Rick Robinson from our friends at Headline Books. And if you're listening to the podcast, the Big Time Talker podcast, you can click on the link below and get right to the book, available now. And if you happen to be watching us live online, you can always send a question in, and we'll be happy to pose it to Rick. 1968 also was a huge presidential election, and it was
Huge.
Nixon, and it was Humphrey, and it was George Wallace, the hugely controversial Alabama governor. That campaign has some comparisons, some similarities to this year, amazingly.
Everything about that last about the 68 campaign relates to this year's 2024 election. You start with the president at both those times. Both of them end up getting out of the race. Lyndon Johnson is a little bit different in the story, in that Johnson goes about pursuing his level of what he thinks is important in the Vietnam side, getting great pushback from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And as you take a look at that, he goes into the first primary. Now, at the time, we'll get to this in a second, but at the time, not every state held primaries. A lot of the states held caucuses. But the first primary at that point in time was New Hampshire. So Johnson goes up to New Hampshire and is running against Gene McCarthy in the race. And everybody expects it to be a blowout, because here you have the sitting president of the United States. Here you have a challenger that's from the progressive wing. And suddenly Johnson wins, but only by a couple points. Now, at the same time that is going on, Tet has just happened. Cronkite had been over in Vietnam during the Tet timeframe. And Cronkite goes on the news and says, we can't win in Vietnam.
And I should stop you there for the folks who are listening or watching who are younger. Walter Cronkite was an incredibly influential CBS news anchor.
It was
Probably
like
bigger
your
than
grandpa
anybody out today, right?
like your grandpa on the television every night telling you what's going on. You trusted him. You sat there and you listened to him and you trusted him. And so Cronkite comes back and does an hour special that closes with a "we can't win." Johnson schedules a press conference. His response apparently was, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the nation."
Right.
And so he schedules a speech from the Oval Office. Most of the people on his staff don't know it's happening. He does the press conference, all the lay out what's going on in Vietnam, and at the end says, and because of what's going on, if I spend any moment other than focusing on Vietnam, I'm not doing you any favors, and I will not run, and I will not accept my party's nomination for president. Shocking everybody. I mean, this is 20 minutes into an otherwise telecast that dealt nothing with it. So then, now you got McCarthy out there, Bobby Kennedy jumps in, splitting the progressive vote, and Hubert Humphrey then jumps into the vice president side. And that's when Kennedy is assassinated after the California Democratic primary. They go into Chicago with no clear nominee, similar to what they could have been going into Chicago this year.
Right.
After Biden does his Johnson impersonation. And they go into that. Here's the interesting trivia and the interesting tie with Vice President Harris. Burke, how many primaries do you think Hubert Humphrey won going into Chicago?
I don't know. None, I'm going to guess.
Not a single primary.
Is that right?
he got all, and this is exactly what's going on right now. He got
Yep.
all of his support in the caucuses from the party elites in the smoke-filled rooms and everything that was going. His delegate count came out of the caucuses. He only got about, in the primary elections, he only got about 2% of the popular vote. Now you get to Chicago, and there's so much happening because the progressives are trying to pass a different platform than the rest of the party is trying to pass on the war. Outside, you have riots in the street, literal riots in the street as people are chanting, "The whole world's watching, the whole world's watching," and police, the Chicago police are battering heads live on television. All of this is going on. Johnson comes out, or Humphrey comes out of the convention so bruised and battered, he has no opportunity to win whatsoever. But again, you look at the differences between it, they're back in Chicago.
Yeah, we're going back again. The Democrats are going
You have a nominee who's not have won a single primary. You have a president that has dropped out of the race. It's uncanny the number of differences. I think the only thing you might have different is that Pat Paulson isn't trying to get a delegate somewhere, but
well, you know,
Pat
when you have
Paulson,
lame duck
for those
president,
younger kids, Pat Paulson was an idol of people our age back in that time frame in '68, who was a comedian who wrote for the Smothers Brothers, who ran for president on the straight talking American government or the Stag Party ticket. So,
he was a funny guy, Pat Paulson.
funny guy.
Rick Robinson is our guest. The book is 1968. You know, another similarity that I think we're about to see is when you have a lame duck president, all the focus goes away pretty quickly from that guy. It went away from Lyndon Johnson in 1968 because of everything else going on in the world. I see that already happening just in the week since President Biden has said, you know, he's not going to run again. All eyes are on Harris, and all eyes, of course, are on Trump. And I'm reminded of this very funny video when Bill Clinton was a lame duck president that they put together for the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where he's just sort of wandering around the White House all by himself.
Yeah, riding a bicycle at one
Riding
point.
the bicycle down the hallway. So I think there are a lot of similarities. You know, the other big political figure that gobbled up a ton of headlines in 1968 was hugely controversial, and that was Alabama Governor George Wallace. And for folks who are listening or watching that may not know why he was a big factor in the world in 1968, sort of paint the picture of who George Wallace was.
George Wallace was a Democratic Southern governor who believed in segregation. He went on the podium and said, segregation now, then segregation now, and segregation forever. He stood at the gates of the state university to try and keep African Americans from going into colleges, into elementary schools. The classic pictures of 1968 revolve around the actions of George Wallace. Wallace gets into the presidential race because a lot of the Southerners felt betrayed by Johnson. Here's Johnson from Texas. He's a Southerner. And what does he do? He goes in and passes the Fair Housing Act. He passes the Civil Rights Act. A lot of the Southern governors were not happy with that. So Wallace decides to run. Wallace decides to jump into the race. Starts out with what could have been a very good strategy for him, in that he was going to get on the ballots in the southern states, try and pick up enough electors where it would pop it into the House of Representatives, and maybe there he might have a chance to win. What he didn't do was, you know, sometimes vice presidential picks matter. Again, this is one that is, again, maybe important for Vice President Harris. It certainly is important for Trump. Vice presidential picks, this is one time it mattered. Up until the day before the announcement of the vice president, Wallace was going to pick Happy Chandler, former Democratic governor from Kentucky, who had also been the commissioner of baseball. Hugely popular.
Right.
Uh, and right beforehand, the people that were backing Wallace did not like the fact that Happy had been involved in breaking the color barrier. He was in part responsible for Jackie Robinson making his way to Major League Baseball. Last minute, they break up. Wallace chooses General Walter LeMay as his running mate. And as they get ready for the press conference, they tell LeMay, whatever you do, don't bring up nuclear weapons in Vietnam. LeMay believed that we should be dropping the bomb on North Vietnam. They introduce him, they bring him up. First thing he says, well, let's talk about the nuclear option in Vietnam. Wallace is so pissed off, he leaves his own press conference where he announces this guy. And that was pretty much the end of the Wallace campaign. He garnered in some of the states maybe 25, 30% of the vote, probably taken equally from both sides, but became a non-factor after that. The other thing he did is Wallace actually got it in his own head that he could win all the states. So he tried to campaign in all the states instead of just the Southern realm, and ended up being a non-factor. That relates though to Bobby Kennedy. And I think the difference being, I've been following the Bobby Kennedy factor in this race very closely. And aside from the fact that he's had his brain eaten by worms, that's not a joke. He's admitted to that. The one thing that if you look at this, Kennedy is on so few ballots. He's not a serious candidate because he has not gotten on enough ballots to try to make any difference
Right.
in the outcome.
Which, by the way, is totally forgotten by history.
Yeah, Wallace wanted to toss it into the House of Representatives. Bobby Kennedy, I'm not sure what his strategy is, but it certainly isn't to win. Again, he probably has as much. He's probably closer to putting it up next to Pat Paulson, and putting him up as a George Wallace figure.
And generally speaking, in today's world, when people talk about 1968 and the presidential election, it's sort of a foregone conclusion that it was going to be Kennedy and Nixon, and Kennedy would have won. But in fact, if you look at the history of what was going on 55 odd years ago, that's not the case. 1968 is this fascinating book that Rick Robinson has put together, and he walks you month by month through the year 1968, which was a pivotal, significant, very controversial year, maybe one of the most significant in American history. And the
All
book
right,
is available
month by month.
Yeah.
Let's do this here, Burke.
All right.
You're back spinning records again.
I'm ready.
All right.
You're dating yourself, but I'm ready.
July 1968. What would have been on the top of your chart that you would have been spinning on July of 1968?
Oh, it would have been a Beatles song, maybe.
No. Hey Jude
Nope.
didn't come out till a little bit later.
Okay.
Hey Jude
I was thinking
dominated
Hey
the
Jude.
year.
All right, tell me.
Jumpin' Jack Flash by the Rolling Stones was top of the Billboard charts. On the R&B charts, I Could Never Love Any Other by the Temps.
The Temptations.
Your buddy Theo Peebles probably still belts that one out occasionally when he's
Absolutely.
on the road. And on the country charts, it was Folsom Prison Blues by Johnny Cash.
Man, 3 classics.
So I open up every chapter kind of trying to give some context to what's going on in the world by listing who's on the cover of Life, who's on the cover of Sports Illustrated, which, by the way, Ted Williams, The Science of Hitting, in 68. Different type of year that we're going to say, in July of 68, the covers were Ted Williams, Ray Nitschke, and Mark Spitz and Denny McLain.
Oh, Denny McLain.
Yeah, that brings you up some backgrounds on that. But it sets the mood for when you think about it. What was on television? Well, it was The Odd Couple, it was Laugh-In, it was Batman and Robin,
Right?
Those type of things. So you get it before you get into the look at what's going on in 68.
So that's an interesting point that you make about this book, 1968. We've been talking a lot about the big news stories, which were political and Vietnam and civil rights movement. But you also dip into the culture back then, and culture was very, very different. You had three television networks. If you were a Batman fan, you knew all about Adam West and Burt Ward. If you weren't a Batman fan, you still knew about Adam West and Burt Ward because there were
There
only
wasn't
three
anything else to
channels.
watch.
It was a whole different thing, and those top 40 hits on your local AM radio station were everywhere. What do you remember personally as a 10-year-old kid growing up in Kentucky about that year? Do you have any personal memories?
I do, and there are several things that stick out very vividly in my mind in '68, and the one that really rings true with me and has been, and one of those things that I think about over and over again as an adult is Bobby Kennedy's assassination, and Martin Luther King's assassination. And I remember them because, as you know, with personal stories, I remember that my dad and I were going to go. My dad was going to take me to a movie in Cincinnati, for to see a movie in Cincinnati on a Saturday afternoon, and we couldn't go because we were worried about violence happening following the Martin Luther King assassination. I don't know that I knew what that meant, but all I knew was, you know, we couldn't go because dad was worried. I can remember walking home from vacation Bible school at the Bromley Christian Church in Bromley, Kentucky, with my cousins, with my cousin Cindy Bethel, and as we're walking in to sit down and watch the funeral procession of Bobby Kennedy. The other thing that I remember though as well is the impact of Vietnam, is the fact that the my grandmother had, I think, the biggest television in the little town of Bromley. And I mean, we're talking, it was a huge console with probably a 12-inch screen, right?
Sure, sure. A piece of
But
furniture.
but all the boys from Bromley would come to grandma's house. Now, it might have been that my two sisters were there, but they also came because grandma had the biggest screen and everybody came to watch the lottery. And what would happen at that time, again, for the youngsters out there, birth dates were drawn. And your local draft board was given a list in order based upon your birth date.
Yeah,
And
this is
if
not
you
the
had
lottery to win money that people watch
it
on
was not a
TV.
lottery to win money. It was a lottery to put your behind on the line. And if you go down that, I mean, you start, if you had a single or double digit number, you know, I can just remember the guys, each time a number was drawn, everybody kind of looking around, do we know anybody on that date? And those are the things that, again, that really stick out in my mind.
We've talked about the similarities between 1968 and this year, 2024. That is one of the big differences. We all had selective service back then. There was a draft on, and I'm a little younger than you, but I certainly remember every family in southern West Virginia where I grew up was affected by the Vietnam War. All those kids went. And in the inner city, as I moved to Washington, D.C., all of those kids went. One day there would be a kid playing basketball on the basketball court. The next day they're in Vietnam, and a week later they may be dead. So
Yeah.
that had to be a very scary time to be a young person, a young man, especially in America.
One of the things I did with this book, Burke, is not just relate all of the news stories that were coming out at the time. I read month by month, and I write a chapter of one month before I do it, but then I would write that month, and when I came up with something that was interesting, I tried to find somebody I knew who could comment from their perspective. When I talked about Tet, I talked about there being being somebody, a doctor who was there,
Right.
a field surgeon who was out at a very remote jungle hospital MASH unit, doing surgery, and the only guy who was the only unit that was authorized to take civilians during Tet. Talked to, when I talk about culture, I talked to a bunch of guys who had garage bands who ended up becoming, some famous, some are still employed in local garage bands. But the one thing that I think really stood out to me, and I talked with several people who Some remain wanted to remain anonymous, but I think it was the time frame that because of what we were watching on those very three channels, all right, coupled with the very personal story in small town America that you and I grew up in, right, of the military car arriving.
Right.
You know, you would be sitting on, and unfortunately, my wife's family went through this a couple of years after 68, but you would be sitting at breakfast on a Sunday morning and a drab green car with no white walls on the tires would pull into the driveway. And you knew exactly why that car was there, and everybody on your block knew that why they were there. And what they were there is to tell you that your son was dead. And I think more than anything else, as those stories start to get told and those stories break without, outside of Logan and Beckley and little places like that, and it gets broader and broader, you have the parents who are grief stricken and the people on either side of you going, I'm so sorry for them, but it's not our son.
Thank God it's not us. Yeah.
Yeah. That's where I think a large part of the change starts coming on Vietnam in 1968, is because of exactly what you're talking about. The three channels, Cronkite, and the stories about the car showing up. That's, nobody wants that green car in front of their house.
The book, it's powerful. It's called 1968. It's by our friend, award-winning author Rick Robinson. A month-by-month look at this very pivotal year in American history where things could have gone completely sideways. So, Rick, I was in Austin, Texas last fall, and I went to the Lyndon Johnson library there, which
Love
is
that
amazing.
library.
If you're ever in Austin, Texas, you get a chance to go to the presidential library for any of these guys, but certainly the Johnson Library was amazing. There was a lot of talk there from their position that it was a dual situation of Vietnam, and he had been told by his doctors, "Look, you're not going to survive. You're not going to make it through another 4 years in office." And he chose to step away, and sure enough, he didn't make it. Barely 4 years out of office. He had health problems. That to me is a striking similarity between what's happening right now with President Biden.
Yeah, Johnson was known that when he got depressed, I mean, here is a big guy, got some diabetes going on, and when he got stressed, you know, give me a shot of whiskey and a half a gallon of ice cream.
Man,
Typical
wow.
of he would just sit there and pound ice cream down. But yeah, he again, another one of the similarities that you take a look at between 68 and 24. It's just so interesting to see it happening. I guess that leads you to, can Harris beat Trump? I mean, that when they came out of the convention, you know, I'm of the opinion that, Humphrey was being Humphrey when he got his coronation from Johnson, okay. One of the deal was, but you can't double back on me on policy. You got to stick with my policy on Vietnam.
Mm.
And the progressives in the Democratic Party really, really didn't like that because they wanted to push for a peace platform at the convention. And so Humphrey, who at the time I think was probably the most liberal person that would ever have been nominated for president or for a nominee for the Democratic Party, ends up getting pushback from the liberal end of the party with regards to that. The other similarity that comes here with, can Harris win? Because Humphrey had trouble uniting the party. Way before he had to try to unite the country, he had to try and reunite the party. Democrats are in a very similar situation here over Gaza because you have a progressive wing that is pro-Palestinian, you have a traditional wing that is pro-Israeli. In order to run the perfect campaign to win, she's going to have to figure out how to unite those two branches of her party and get them excited to go out and vote for her. I think that's probably for the Harris campaign the most important thing she could be doing right now.
You know a little bit about politics early in your career. You spent some time on Capitol Hill. I'm not going to ask you necessarily to armchair quarterback this thing, but since you did this deep dive into 1968, and now we have all these similarities with 2024, any guesses as how this might shake out?
Um, I think it's going to be a close election. I think it's going to be an election in which right now in an area where we have yet to go in the campaign. And that is, um, to quote my old friend PJ O'Rourke, the cry from the far middle. Um, and because if she can reunite the party, Trump can gather the never Trumpers versus everything else. They can gather, they both have a base, but it's this middle group of folks that they do. And I think what's going to happen is this may be one of those times where issues are going to actually matter. That we're not going to be voting that those folks in the middle that are going to decide this election in every state may be actually more interested in uh, what the policy would be for domestic monetary policy of the Federal Reserve and interest rates, might be more interested in that than they will be whether or not the latest insult from one side or the other happens to come down.
Wouldn't that be a refreshing thing, huh? It'd be
Could
amazing.
be. It could be. Well, I think both sides had to pick somebody who can relate to that middle, and I think that's why Trump went with J.D. Vance, because his background, his upbringing, less about the issues of where he stands on things, but that because look, nobody votes for a vice president,
Right.
but can that person take the message out and be believable? And I think that's why Trump picked Vance. Harris is going to have to go through the same thing right now. She has basically three options. She can go with, somebody in a swing state where they would actually believe that maybe that might swing enough votes to win a swing state. I don't think that's going to happen. She can go with chemistry, that if my nominee is going to be somebody I work with and like very much and the chemistry just met, or she can go with someone who has played well, a Democrat who has played well in Republican sandboxes, which there's only two. So you're going to have either Andy Beshear or Governor Cooper. Kentucky or the Carolinas, one or the other, are going to be the people in that category. I am told that Senator Kelly is the early leader in all of that field. They think that he might actually have enough popularity to swing Arizona. But again, I think right now it's going to be interesting to see where she heads with that.
Senator Kelly, former astronaut, and that leads me to ask you about the Apollo, the space program, which began in 1960 and culminated with the moon landing in '69. Did Apollo factor into all this turmoil in 1968? I'm curious as to what you
Yeah.
learned when you went back and dove into the papers from the day.
I mean, I remember that happening. I mean, I remember my parents sitting me down and making me watch the three astronauts that went up, who, very much as a surprise to some of the people at NASA, and very much to the consternation of the American Atheist Party, read Genesis from the capsule as they circled the moon.
Wow.
When you turn on your television, you see this grainy black and white pictures of the Earth in the background, and you hear, Jim Lovell going, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. That's when you talk about things that stick out of my mind. That's one of them. I
That's
remember.
powerful. That's
Yeah, this
really
is the
powerful.
last picture. So they go up, and it's almost as if by divine providence. But really, it's because I think the tension going on in America following the election is now over. Nixon has won. Vietnam is still going on. Everything that is happening, everybody wants something to cheer for. Everybody wants something. And the Apollo 8 of 19, I believe it was 8 of 1969 when it went up, the Apollo mission became the center of everything. Top headline in every newspaper. Everybody's watching it every night on their one of their 3 channels on their black and white Zenith,
Right, sure.
adjusting the antennas on the top of it to make sure they get a clearer picture. This becomes the end of 68. And what was really cool was that one of the astronauts who was in the command module as they're going around the moon, he said they got thousands upon thousands of letters after they landed. He said, but the one that he kept was some guy who sent him a letter that said, "Thank you for saving 1968." Yeah, it did. 68 started out on a horrible note with what was going on in Tet, but it ended with this revitalization of the American spirit through the Apollo program.
And it was a great unifier. And I think it's interesting as we do look at this year, and certainly in this last month as we record this podcast in late July, it's been one major news story after the other, and people have whiplash. And you see certainly, Rick, a lot on social media, which thank God did not exist in 1968, that a lot of pants on fire, the world's coming to an end, everything is horrible. But contextually, if you compare what's going on in 2024 to 1968, when you had Vietnam and you had the Kennedy assassination, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the civil rights, the protest, you had Nixon. I mean, all of that context matters, and you go, okay, I think we're going to be okay. If we can get through 68, we'll be fine this year.
Yeah, and again, that's when I was talking with one of the people I interviewed with regards to the assassination of King. We had a wonderful discussion. A gentleman who I've known for years, helped me when I ran for Congress in 68, was the first African-American police officer in one of our larger cities in Kentucky. And we were sitting down over coffee. And I think he said it best, is that the voices today are so much louder.
You're right.
Doesn't mean they're more important, doesn't mean they're right, doesn't mean anything else, but the bellowing loudness of saying things on social media that you would never, as we were growing up, say to anybody.
Sure.
But suddenly, because you're hidden behind a keyboard, you feel the need and the ability and I'm just going to comment on something and be very loud about it. Doesn't mean that it's a trend, doesn't mean that it's something that's happening, but boy, is it loud.
People just feel like they need to weigh in, whether they know anything about it or not.
I was ready to give up my law degree because there were so many people online that had gone to Facebook law school.
Yeah, it was amazing how many people suddenly became Secret Service experts in the couple of weeks after the Trump assassination attempt. And, I hear you. 1968, a pivotal year in America, and a great new book examines that pivotal year. It's by our friend Rick Robinson. Hey, let's talk about some of the fun stuff from that year. Your favorite song from 1968?
Well, I mean, it's hard to get past.
Oh, come on now.
Hey Jude.
You got to pick one.
I was just going to say, it's hard to get past Hey Jude.
Yeah.
But I mean, think of, and I would go back and if you're reading this book, Burke, in Middle Tennessee or in Middle West Virginia, who was the garage band that everybody listened to?
Oh, 1968. Who would that have been?
Well, even when you were spinning records.
Oh, when I was, back in the early 80s. Yeah, the big garage bands. Oh, there were so many. Who did you like?
Well, see, that's what I kind of go to with me is that, as a kid, for instance, there was a band called the Dingoes.
Yeah.
And the Dingoes were a band, and they were kind of on the leading edge of, when everybody else started playing the Beatles, they started playing the Who.
Gotcha.
Those type of things. Then you had over in across the river from us the Lemon Pipers.
Sure.
Actually became famous with That Girl, the hit That Girl.
Yeah.
And there was a band in Northern Kentucky that, and this is the funny one, that their drummer was some guy who became one of the greatest guitarists of all time, and the guitarist was Adrian Belew.
No kidding.
But yeah, he started out as a drummer. In fact, was born about a block away from where I lived when I was in '68.
From King
But
Crimson, sure.
but Adrian was Steve at the time. Got mono, had to stay home, and one of his bandmates brought him a guitar and said, "Here, learn how to play." And he took that and later became the lead guitarist for Frank Zappa, became the lead guitarist for uh, uh,
King
David
Crimson, yeah,
Bowie,
yeah,
frontman
Bowie.
for Talking Heads. Just go over the whole thing. Nine Inch Nails he played with, and of course he's got what, a dozen solo albums. So to me, the music of that time, it was an era where '68 was one of the years that had a soundtrack. It came out with the soundtrack, and that's whether you like R&B, whether you like country, whether you like pop, it had its own soundtrack. But so I think about the music, I think about the local bands that there was a garage band that used to practice 2 doors down from my house, and that was all the kids would hang out in front and listen to them. So you listen to all that stuff, and but how can you not just say the song of the year wasn't "Hey Jude"?
All right, I'll give you that.
I mean, that's a long way to get back to "Hey Jude."
And you mentioned the Odd Couple movie earlier. There were some great movies that year. One of my favorite action movies of all time, Bullet, with Steve McQueen, with that great car chase.
Yeah, Bullet was one of the theaters were important at the time. I'm not so much now because, my gosh, how quick does everything go to Netflix? I'm amazed. I still travel a lot for a living, and I get on, I get in my Delta seat and I look at things and going, wow, that's already on the Delta app.
Right, right,
Uh,
immediately.
almost immediately, and so you look at it and go, but at the time, I mean, it was a big deal when the movie opened up with Bonnie and Clyde, or
Was that the year
Right,
2001, A
well,
Space Odyssey came out? Was that
2001 came out in
yeah.
'68. Yeah, you had a Bullet, great movie. I remember my dad taking me to see Bullet. Um,
Yeah, the Green Beret movie, the John Wayne Green Berets, I think was
right.
68 or 69, somewhere in there. So
So you have a lot of these movies that are coming out, and it was a big deal. People went to the theater. Families went to the theater. Date night was at the theater. Every little town had a theater. What else are you going to do? Stay home and watch that black and white Zenith?
that's right. When you can go watch a black and white movie at the theater, like the now legendary movie. This is one I know came out in 68 because I'm a horror movie aficionado. The low budget movie filmed right outside Pittsburgh, Night of the Living Dead, the first
Night
one.
of the Living Dead. Yeah, that was actually one of the '68 movies.
Yeah.
Good pickup there, Burke Allen.
I remember that one very well. So this book, 1968, by my friend Rick Robinson, a departure from what he normally does. He's a longtime political insider and attorney, but he writes political thrillers generally and a lot of fiction stuff. This is a month by month look at one of the most pivotal years in American history. And you can do a deep dive into Vietnam, into the assassination of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, the civil rights movement. Uh, I have to ask you before we let you jump, and I know we're almost out of time.
I was looking at this Bobby Goldsboro Honey. That was one. If you
Maybe
want to,
not on the same level as Hey Jude.
not on the same level as Hey Jude.
What surprised you when you went back to research this book? Because I know you were alive then, you were a kid, but you were alive. But what surprised you that you maybe didn't know or didn't remember from 1968?
Two things. One was the context, and it was difficult, Burke, to read newspapers from 1968.
Mm.
And I say that because the level of language and racism and misogyny in print that you wouldn't see today.
Is that right? See, that surprises me.
So you get these I've told people these let me give you a couple of headlines. Boys want to know, should they date a girl that smokes pot? Uh, the worst one of them all was a headline that read, um, before a League of Women Voters forum, a headline that read, "Our ladies, God bless them, they have opinions too."
Oh my God. Wow.
Now that's on the, basically for women, you would get the Wednesday copy of the local newspaper, and it would be the shopping news and who was doing what for whatever gala and ball was coming up. A little bit different for African Americans. At that time, the only way they got in the paper was if they played high school sports. There is the papers are devoid of information with regards to the African American communities during those time frames, and you have to really dig down deep to try and find what was going on there, which I was able to do through some of the interviews that took place. Um, but it's the context is just difficult at sometimes to deal with.
That's fascinating. And
I
there's
think that's probably the thing. And then you look at it, and of course we talked about this, the similarities. Everything that's old is new again. I mean, we're still talking about Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King killed. What are we talking about? Gun control. What are we talking about after an assassination attempt on President Trump? Gun control. What some of these issues just don't go away.
deja vu all over again for sure. Hey, one question just came into me on my cell phone, an interesting text question from someone who's watching online right now. And I'll paraphrase because it's kind of a long text, but they want to know how it is that someone who is seen today so unpopularly like Nixon, how he won. And I think that's a great question when you talk about how things shift over time. And they say that the guy with the pen writes history. We look at Nixon today and you think of this sweaty, lying, profane guy in the corner office. How did he become the leader of the free world?
By the great redo. I mean, Nixon goes out. He's vice president of the United States under Ike. He becomes the nominee against John Kennedy and loses based upon two things. One, those who watch the debate, he's this sweaty lump sitting next to a very, a very
Hollywood looking
well
guy. Yeah. Yeah.
looking young guy who actually used makeup. The biggest person missing from the ticket in 60 was not his vice presidential candidate. It was in fact a makeup person at the debate. He goes out, he loses, and the other reason he loses is because, well, let's face it, you talk about election fraud, you know, he lost Illinois clearly by Richard Daley's stuff in the ballot box in Chicago.
Right.
There's no doubt about that. He did not challenge the election. He goes out, decides to run for governor of California, loses there, has the great line, "You don't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore." So what do? They come up with a new look of Dick Nixon. Somebody who can they can try and get to relate to things, somebody who they can try and look at. And to be honest with you, he was elected in large part. I think Humphrey was charging near the end of that campaign. Still got beat horribly. But if there wouldn't have been the dissension that you had coming out of the Democratic National Convention, riots in the streets, the party battling back and forth in a civil war over Vietnam, I wonder if Nixon would have won. I wonder if there had been another 6 weeks on the campaign, would Humphrey have been able to unite everybody? Had all of it come together? Nixon was not at that time the despicable man that we all remember from Watergate. The
Right.
public image at that time was something far different. Just another guy from California, just a Quaker from California.
Jill, thanks for the text question. And
Yeah,
it is interesting when you think about how our perceptions have been based on a little bit of news footage from back in the day. If you want to really find out about the year 1968 and what a pivotal year it was in American history, pick up this book. I can't recommend it more highly, by my buddy, award-winning author Rick Robinson. Hey, where do you suggest people go to get this thing?
go to headlinebooks.com, or you can go on to Amazon, or you can call up your local bookstore, and if they don't have it, shout at them. Ask them why.
Come on. We
Come
need the
on.
Rick Robinson book.
Either way, we would love to have you read this and love to have your comments once you're finished.
Rick, thanks for spending some time with us today. Sure appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Bert. Great to see you, pal.
1968 by Rick Robinson, a small town deep dive into one of the most significant and controversial years in American history. This is a page turner, month by month look into this big year, and it'll help us all understand how 1968 helped shape the country, and all the similarities between 68 and 2024 will make your head spin. Hey, thank you to Headline Books for having us today as we do the simulcast of Zoom into Books and the Big Time Talker podcast. Thanks to our sponsor, SpeakerMatch.com. For our special guest, award-winning author of 1968, Rick Robinson, I'm Burke Allen. Thank you so much for being here. Now go out and make it a great day. Bye, everybody.